Hello, everybody. Hi, this is Amit Doshi from IVN Podcasts. Let us get started. Let me talk to you. Well, let's see how many people are there. Okay, there are about 10, 12 people here already. So let's get started. Excuse me. Let me just get my coffee here. All right. Okay. So let's see. So I wanted to talk to everybody a little bit about podcasting. I'm going to give you a brief kind of outlook on where we're at right now, what the podcasting industry is about today. Then we'll talk a little bit about trends. We'll talk about challenges. We'll talk about like the opportunities for marketing in podcasts, and then we will discuss. If you want to do a podcast, what should you be looking at? And then I'll open this up for questions at that point in time. Okay. So let's see. First question. So first, let's talk a little bit about podcasting. So I started IBM Podcast 4 years ago in 2015 March. The idea behind it was, hey, you know what? We're missing some talk. We're missing some conversational content over here. Let's start looking at audio and series space. Let's start doing some stuff over there. So that's where that's where we started, right? And the I guess the question is that we started a point where people used to ask the question, what is a podcast? And today I think that's a question which we are fortunately no longer required to answer as much as we used to have to, right? The so Today, I mean, more and more people know what podcasts are, especially if you are in a space which is if you're in a media space, or if you're in a space where you're more aware to what's going on internationally, you are aware of what a podcast is today. And so that has been a big kind of move forward. How many people are listening to podcasts today is okay, an interesting thing, right? I mean, it's difficult to get precise numbers around this, but we've done a little bit of math around how many listeners we have, how many listeners some apps have, what kind of content is being heard by people listening in India, what percentage of content of that is ours. And we've come to the idea that, or not the idea, I think the somewhat educated estimate that there are probably single digit million listeners in podcasts, so maybe anywhere between 2 and 5 million listeners in this country. That means that we're still very, very early in this space. There's still a lot to happen. But at the same time, it is kind of encouraging because we've come here from nowhere. We've come here from, with absolutely no thought whatsoever, sorry, with absolutely no background in this kind of content whatsoever. The audience today is also a very urban audience, and I think that that's going to change as time goes on. Right now, we're seeing many. We're seeing a very, very urban audience. We're seeing an audience that is primarily, well, not primarily, but I mean, like, about 55 to 60% of our content is consumed between Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, and Hyderabad, between those four urban centers, right? And I think that that's something that, as we move forward, we're going to see a lot more others. So we're going to see a lot more smaller cities. We're going to see a lot other cities get into the start listening to this content as well, which we're already seeing some uptake in, but it still is very urban so focused. Today, the audience is also very English first audience. I don't think that that is something that's going to continue to be the case, right? In my mind, for if this business is to grow the way that I think that it will, English will probably be one of the major languages, but we need to have presence in all kinds of other languages. So I think that is something that we're going to start seeing a lot more of. I mean, like, at our end, we've started working on that already. We have a few shows in Hindi, we have a show in Marathi, we have a show in Kannada. We're looking to expand the number of shows. We're looking to expand the number of languages that we are working in. So yeah, so that's just that's an overview of the podcasting industry as I see it today, as I see what's going on right now. Let me talk to you a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in the podcasting space. Uh, so generally, there is really, really good growth organically, right? I mean, given that we're a bootstrap small operation without much in the way of funding, we've been very, very kind of careful around how we spend money on marketing. So we haven't spent that much. But at the same time, we've been growing at a pretty good rate from a on a pure organic consumption basis, right? That is, I think, a very encouraging trend. And I think that that's a trend that we'll see accelerating, especially as we start deploying more resources towards marketing. Uh, we're starting to see a lot more non-metro consumption. As I mentioned earlier, right now about 55 to 60% is being consumed in the four major cities. But we're starting to see a lot of stuff. We're starting to see a lot of consumption happening in smaller and smaller cities. Now, each of these small cities is like, I mean, like for us, Bombay's 20, Delhi's 20, Bangalore's 15, Hyderabad's 10. So I mean, like that's a fairly broad, or that's a fairly big chunk of the audience. A lot of the smaller cities right now are already much, much smaller pieces. Like, you'll get like 0.5% from Bhopal or Indore or something like that, right? And you really want to, we're starting to see more of that. So I think that's going to start increasing. I think that that's going to also kind of move into more than the tier two towns, more into the tier three towns, tier four towns. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of that kind of consumption as well. I think another trend that is interesting, as I mentioned, was non-English content being created. So we are already creating a lot of non-English content, but we are going to also, but besides that, we're also looking at like, what are the different, we are very Bombay focused right now, right? In terms of the kind of content we're creating, we are looking at how do we do some work in Bangalore, we do some work in Delhi, but we are very Bombay focused in terms of where our content is getting created on. And as we go forward, I think that that is something that is we're also going to have to change, right? We're going to have to look at how do we create more, how do we have more centers which content is being created from? Because one of the interesting things I think that is there about talk is it's very local. People want to consume it in a very, very local sense. Uh, Let's see. What are some of the challenges that we have? I think one of the big challenges is, we started from a very small, from a very, very small base, right? As we start from a small base, how do we kind of how do we make it how do we grow it beyond that small base? I think that's one of the big challenges here, and I think again that comes through awareness, that comes through having a moment, right? That comes through having kind of something which is more effective. Sorry, that comes from having like a piece which kind of breaks through pop culture, right? Which becomes something more popular. Like in the US, there are generally considered to be two factors which broke podcasting out into mainstream, right? Factor number one was Apple putting the podcast app as a standalone app on their phone, on their iPhone. And factor number two would be the release of Serial, which moved from a which moved things from basically a small niche audience into more of a mass awareness kind of space. And I think that we're going to need to have moments like that happen in India, a succession of moments. One single moment's not going to do it. Let's see, what did I have next? What is needed for podcasting to come of age? I mean, like, I think that's an interesting question. I'm seeing there are a lot of questions over here, so I'll get to those quickly. What is needed for podcasting to come of age? So it's going to take some time. It's going to take some patience. It's going to take some building of awareness. It's going to need, as I mentioned, some sort of breakout moment, some sort of moment where people are. Considering or some sort of moment where people where this breaks out of like the niche that it's in right now, and people have more broader awareness of it. I think that that will come fairly soon. And again, I think one of the things that we need is we need more brand support than we're getting right now. Right now we have a few brands that are working with us, but we're going to need more and more brands to come on board with this. Another challenge is that we have a lack of talk radio culture in this country. So, generally speaking, podcasting has been an evolution of listening to talk radio, right? The same way that people evolved from watching broadcast television into watching YouTube and Netflix, or the same way that people evolved from reading books into reading a Kindle, or the same way that you evolved from listening to music on DVDs to listening to things over Savan or Apple Music or Ghana. Similarly, generally in most of the rest of the world, talk radio culture has been the place that which listeners have evolved into podcasting from. We don't have that over here, so that's a little bit of a challenge. But I think that that also leads to a little bit of an opportunity, right? In the sense that the more people who the fact that there are consistent populations that are listening to talk radio across the rest of the world, right? So those podcasts are going to start, or sorry, those listeners in India have not been served right now. Podcasting is the first time that they are being served. So I think what we'll wind up seeing is that we will start seeing similar kinds of numbers happen here in the long term. Let's see. Let me talk a little bit about how podcasts work in reference to marketing, and then after that, we can get into the Q&A pieces. I'll go through the questions that have been submitted so far. So podcast in reference to marketing. So we work with brands generally in two broad ways. We do branded content. We'll do shows which brands are asking us to create for them on their behalf, which speak to the brand values, which speak to the brand ethos. I think that is an interesting piece, and I think that that's something that will continue to happen. We're seeing a lot of brands that have been interested in doing that kind of work. We've been doing some stuff with, we've done some stuff with the Aditya Mutual Fund. We've done some stuff with Motilal Oswal. We've done some stuff with HDFC Bank. We've done some work for Empower, which is a mental health organization. We've done a project for a poker online poker playing website called Spartan Poker. The show was called Merakan Poker. So I think branded content is one piece that is quite interesting. The other way that we work with brands is we create promos for them on our content, right? And I think that that is a very strong thing because what happens over here is you get the benefit of an audience already created. You don't need to create an audience, which you do in the case of branded content. But the other thing that happens is that you get the benefit of using the host of a show as an influencer. Podcast advertising or podcast promos generally happen in what's called a host read format. A host read format allows the host to talk about basically we'll have the host give you a will give you copy around the product that needs to be pushed. That allows for the transference of the trust that the trust and also quite honestly the liking, the affection that listeners have for their host gets transferred to the product or gets transferred to the brand that's being spoken about, and that generally leads to really really good memorability, really really good. Uplift in terms of how people consider the brand, how memorable the brands are. There are some interesting studies around how memorable podcast advertising is as opposed to other forms of advertising. Midroll, which is a podcast advertising company, had done a study a couple of years ago. And what they found was that unaided recall rate in podcasting was at 65% compared to 13% at YouTube. Aided recall rate at podcasting was at 96% compared to 65% at YouTube, which I thought was a really interesting piece. So I think that it's a really good opportunity for brands, and I think that there are a lot of things that they can do, there are a lot of options, there are a lot of opportunities in terms of the kind of creatives that we can do as well in when it comes to promos, right? A lot of podcast ads are narrative in nature. A lot of podcast ads are serialized in nature, where they'll be like, every week you'll have the next version of an ad. So I think those are interesting areas that we can do stuff with for brands, and I think that we're going to start seeing brands start using these more and more. Some already are. We're having a lot of conversation with others who are really interested in this space, and I think we're going to see more happening there. Let me before I get to the Q&A, just a quick thing. If anybody's looking to make a podcast, here are a couple of things I would suggest. Be persistent. You need to kind of work on it, even if it seems like the rewards are not immediately apparent. You constantly look at making your content better. You have to keep evolving it, and maintain regularity. I think the regularity part is something that a lot of people are not as focused on as they probably should be. Consistency of releases is probably, I think, in my mind, the single most important thing to get a podcast successful. So do that, and let me get to the Q&A now. Let's see. First question I got is from Saurav Khante. Are Indians catching up on the podcast scene in the coming years? Should we see podcasts as the next thing people play in the cars instead of music or radio? I think you're going to see that. I think that as more and more technology develops, which turns the car into a connected piece, so I think that you're going to see more and more of that. You can already see a great deal of that in. We know that Apple with Apple CarPlay and Android with Android Auto are making serious inroads into the car systems, right? And so as they start doing that, I think what you will start seeing is, or rather, as those things get more popular, as voice becomes more of a thing in car, I think you will start seeing podcast consumption happening more and more in car. I don't know that so you use the word instead, and instead, I don't know if that is the right word. I think. Just because people will start consuming content in this form, I don't know that they will stop consuming content in other forms, right? I think that you will have a certain amount of that, but I don't think that that will be I don't know if that's going to be so. If it's going to be a complete replacement. The next question is from Hey Nikhil, how are you? Sai Nikhil Dinta Kurti. AIB podcast worked well as views are on in the millions. Is there something that they did well? I think they millions of views were in their video podcasts, and I think YouTube as a platform allows for viewership in those kinds of numbers. I think YouTube or allows is a strong is a bad word, but I mean, like, YouTube is a powerful platform, and within YouTube, if you are creating content, AIB, those guys are fantastic. They're really really popular. They know what they're doing. They're very funny, and so they put together really good content. They put it on video and they put it on YouTube. So the numbers are different. In audio podcasting, we're trying to build different kinds of we're trying to build a different kind of thing, right? We're trying to build a new way of listening. In the long run, I do believe that audio podcasting numbers have the potential to be larger than video podcasting numbers. This is what you see internationally generally right now. But again, there is a continuation that occurs, right? People were able to people kind of evolved from talk radio into podcasting, whereas over here, that initial evolution was not there. The next question is from Abhishamsa Mathur. How can a podcaster effectively use social media to promote a podcast? So here's the thing. One of the things that we get that we get a little discombobulated with is this idea in social media that a post will lead to a click, will lead to a view. Podcasting does not work like that, because what happens is that the behavior during which you are consuming social media is very active, whereas the behavior in which you are consuming podcasts are not as active, right? Or rather, they're not active at the same time. You consume a podcast primarily during when you're doing other activities. Podcasts are consumed when you're working out, when you're commuting, or when you are doing chores of some nature. These are the three broad ways when people consume podcasts. So if that is the case, whereas social media, when you're consuming social media, you're actively engaged with your device. That's what you're doing. You're engaging with your device. So what that means is that social media is a great tool for branding your podcast, but social media is not going to be a way where you're going to drive listens to each individual episode. So you have to think about how do you create content on social media which is memorable. You have to think of how do you create content which is memorable and which will stick with the listener to the point where they'll be like, when they're listening to a podcast or they're ready to listen to a podcast, at that point they will then be able to go out and get it. Or they will have you top of the mind so that they will remember that they should go out and get it. The next question I have is from Aishwarya Chakravarti. Any scope for podcast to impact tier two or tier three cities at any point in time? I think that that's a natural evolution. I think that we're already starting to see that. As I mentioned earlier, our audience growth has been first and foremost in the four major cities, but after that, we are starting to see more and more happen. Nikhil has more and more happen in smaller cities. Nikhil has another question, and can we consider it better format as video or audio? I think that calling it better is setting up in opposite, setting these two things in opposition where they don't really need to be. I think every content type has a place where you're going to consume it. I consume video, I consume audio, I consume reading. I consume books, I consume magazines, I consume websites, I consume all kinds of things. Right? I don't think it's an either or. I think that you consume what you feel like you should consume at any given point in time. I don't know that these things are in opposition to each other. Depending on the use case you have at any given point in time, you find the right kind of media to consume. Ankur Vora asks, what type of content works for you and the brands that you partner with, and the brands that partner with you? So we've been having a lot of conversations with people in the BFSI space right now. That has been one of the big areas where people have been working with us. But I think that generally speaking, for podcasts, what are the kinds of brands? So the type of content that works for us is, I mean, like we've seen content of all kinds work, right? Our most popular show is Cyrus Rocha show, Cyrus Says. But our next most popular shows are mostly in the public policy area. Shows like Scene and Scene with Amit Verma, the Pragati podcast. We've had a lot of success with shows in the business space. The Ronnie Screwvala podcast, the Filter Coffee podcast with Karthik Nagarajan, Advertising is Dead with Varun Dugirala. So we had a lot of success with those shows as well. Self help has worked really well for us. The Habit Coach with Asher Doctor. Uh, Then we have a show called the Positivity Podcast with Chetna. These shows are all doing well for us. So I think that the kinds of podcasts that work are of all different kinds. The kinds of brands that we've been working with so far have mostly been in financial services. We've seen some success in travel brands, and we're looking at more and more different brands which are across the different space. We're talking to a lot of tech brands right now. We're talking to a lot of consulting brands right now. So I think we're looking at a lot of brands. I think the kinds of brands for whom podcasting works well is brands who are looking for an affluent audience. I think that is probably the best thing right now. Fareen Wazir asks, is making a podcast as easy as it seems? Well, Fareen, making a podcast is very easy. Making a good podcast is very hard. I think that's a glib and somewhat, well, I mean, like, that's a true answer, I think. I mean, like, I think making a good podcast gets tough. Uh, how about monetize? This is Salman Mushir. How about monetization in the podcasting space? Are people taking it up professionally like IBM? Well, so far I think we are the only ones that are working on this as a network. There are a number of platforms, tech platforms that are working on it, or people are looking at doing distribution platforms. From a content network, there are a lot. From a content side, there are a lot. From the content side, there are a lot of people doing a lot of interesting content. Suno India has a number of shows. Musafir has a number of shows. But I think that there are very few networks per se in that, right? Uh, so yeah, so I mean, like some people are taking it professional, but I mean, it's still tough to monetize. I mean, like monetization is not where we'd want it to be. Do podcasts have brands? Yes, absolutely. Whether it is the idea, sorry, this question was from Mansi Mirani. Do podcasts have brands? They absolutely do. We can, as I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk, we either do things as we either do branded content for podcasts for brands, or we will work with them to kind of place promos on our shows. How does one go? This is from Rajiv Gupta. How does one go about starting doing all this? Uh, that's a tough question. You just look at. I mean, like I wanted to start a podcasting network, and then I just did. If you want to work on a podcast, send us an email, creators@indusvox.com, and we're happy to talk to you about what kind of stuff we can work with you. Nisarg Joshi, what is the ideal length of a podcast series? Interesting. So, ideal length of a podcast episode or a podcast series? Both are interesting questions, right? Ideal length of a podcast episode, I don't think that there is an ideal length for a podcast episode. We have episodes which are 5 minutes long, and we have episodes which are 2.5 hours long. So, I don't think that there is an ideal length. All of these can work really well. I think regularity is more important. I think consistency is more important. Uh, and in terms of a series, well, I mean, like, here's the thing. I think short series work well in the US. I think in India right now, doing a short series is probably a hard thing to do because what happens is that we need time to build audiences, right? And if you're doing a very short series, then the amount of pressure you have in terms of marketing it immediately becomes a lot more tough, right? So we do have some shows which we have done in the series method, but it is tough to do that. Um, let's see. The next question I have. Since you spoke about Ankur Vora, since you spoke about branded content, is it strategic or tactical? Very strategic. It is about uh, making the voice kind of felt. Because, see, the thing is, again, podcasting is about creating brand recognition in the long run. And for a brand, that's where it is, right? Podcasting is not going to lead to a it's not going to lead to a situation where you have something happening very quickly, right? You're not going to, because the way that you consume a podcast, your phone is in your pocket or your phone is off, your phone is not on at that point in time. So for you to move from there into something else becomes a little challenging. It's a little tough to kind of see that happen. So I think that it is more important that we thought of strategically. It is something that you're doing to create the people who will engage with the podcast will think very fondly of your brand in that sense, right? But it is something that they might not consume, they might not convert on immediately. There will maybe be some people, there'll be people who will talk about your brand 3 years later when somebody tells them that, hey, there is, I want to do XYZ thing. And they're like, oh, you know what? I remember listening to this podcast from this place and you should go and check that out. So it works like that. What are the main, Rajiv Gupta asks, what are the main publishing avenues for podcasts? So our listenership happens on, so Apple Podcasts is disproportionately high for us, considering how low iPhone penetration in India is. but Apple is a big distribution point for us. Castbox, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts are big on the open RSS system. Besides that, we have good partnerships with companies like Savan, Spotify, and Ghana, so our content's available from them as well. The next question I have is Farhan Rajani is asking, how do you educate the vernacular audience about podcasts? They only know radio. How do you differentiate it from radio? You differentiate it with the type of content that you have, right? Yes, they are aware of radio primarily at this point in time. That is what they are aware of. But the way, I mean, like, how did at one point in time the audience was aware of television? How did they become aware of YouTube, right? So I mean, like, it is the same kind of thing. There's a natural progression in media consumption over the last 20 years, where we have seen all media consumption go from what is essentially a broadcast or physical media based consumption pattern into a on demand consumption pattern. And I think the same thing, you're starting to see the same thing in music, in audio, and in talk, we're jumping directly into on demand. Uh, Mansik Nikar is asking, are there any famous case studies nation and worldwide as a reference? For podcasting, there are many. There are many case studies across all different kinds of use cases, right? There are case studies which show the benefit of podcasting as a medium. There are for subscription content. There are case studies which show the benefit of podcasting as a medium for branded content, for sorry, for subscription brands or for content brands. There are all kinds of case studies. I don't know which one. I think the most famous one that you can look at from an audience perspective or from an audience growth perspective would be Serial. I think that one did really well. Mailchimp's branding on Serial, right, also did phenomenally well for them because they did some really interesting ad content over there. There is another very interesting case study around an insurance company called Hiscox, which worked with a TV show, which worked with a startup. There's a very interesting case study for a insurance brand called Hiscox that worked with a podcast called Startup, created by Gimlet Media, where they did narrative ads, successive narrative ads every week. It would change, and it was around doing non-traditional insurance policies. So in the show Startup, they would talk about these different businesses. So it was kind of a very tightly integrated piece as well. Farhan Rajni asks, will the podcast industry ever fight the copyright issue? Ever? Well, I don't think so. It's possible, but it's very unlikely. I don't think that I mean, like, we maintain rights to our content. So, I mean, like, we don't want people cutting our content and putting them up in different ways. So we kind of respect the same thing. We don't really just mess with people's content. Farhan is asking, have you heard Man Ki Baat? I have heard Man Ki Baat. Actually, I was a little worried about this particular session because we were competing with the live Man Ki Baat at 11 a.m. But yes, I have heard of it. I always call Narendra Modi the biggest podcaster in India. uh, Vikash Singh asked, "What are the top two metrics you measure for a podcast?" I look at downloads. I look at listener downloads. To me, that is the number one metric there is. There are other metrics you can look at in terms of, like, what is the frequency, what is the growth, what time of the day people are listening at. But most of podcasting works on a infrastructure which allows for very minimal analytics to occur. You get a download number primarily, but because we work on an RSS feed, we don't get deep analytics like drop off and stuff like that. You get that from platforms like Savan and Ghana and Book My Show Jukebox, and then you have to extrapolate from that outwards. But the kind of analytics that we get in podcasting is a little lower, is a little smaller. Suraj Vardhan asks, at what point does a podcast take over mainstream entertainment? I think podcast is mainstream entertainment. I spend a lot of time on podcast, in terms of where I listen to it. So I think that for the people who listen to it, it is mainstream. It's one of the highest consumed pieces of content. It's for people who don't listen to it right now. We have to kind of create it and we have to grow awareness. Let's see. Manas Nayak is asking, can you discuss few cases of brands in India successfully using podcasts as a marketing tool? It'd be a great help. Podcast definition of basic idea. We will certainly have by now. So who is using podcasting as a marketing tool? So we did a show called MF101 for Aditya Birla Mutual Fund, which I think worked well for them. We currently have a show called Equity Sahi Hai for Motilal Oswal, which is doing well for them. Mera Kaam Poker did well for Spartan Poker. These are all podcasts created which speak to what the brand activities are, and so I think that these have worked well for them. When it comes to doing branding on shows, StoryTell has been working with us for quite a while, and so they have been fairly happy with the activities that we have done on their behalf. Where what we do for StoryTell is an online audiobook platform. It's similar to what they do. Is you basically it's a subscription based thing where you can go and listen to audiobooks, right? And so what we do with them is on Cyrus's show, on Amit Verma's show, and on our Marathi show Golgappa, we do book recommendations that people should go and listen to on Storytel, and that has led to a pretty good that's led to a fairly good outcome for them. Suraj Vardhan asks, when will IBM have a show on our environment? We are working on it. We're actually working on I don't know if this is exactly environmental, but it is somewhat environmental because it's somewhat related. We're working on a show with the Good Food Institute right now. It's not out yet. It's going to be out soon. But it's about basically looking at environmentally conscious alternatives to meat. Besides that, we are looking at doing some shows on the environment as well. That's one of my main pet areas of interest. Uh, let's see. Jagrati Verma asked, "Do you feel podcasts can work better for B2B communication than B2C at this point?" I think podcast is a very broad umbrella term. I think that it will work for B2B. I think it will work for B2C. I think it will work for everything. I think that the word podcast is similar to the word video, right? I mean, like video will include everything from a corporate video, will include training videos, will include sacred games. It will include everything, right? So I think the word podcast is very this. Sorry, it's very broad. Uh, Rajiv Gupta, where do you publish the podcasts that you spoke about just now? We publish them all over the place. They're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, our website, our app, Castbox, Pocket Casts, Savan, Ghana, Spotify. Basically, anywhere that you can listen to SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can listen to our stuff. Mud Ki Baat qualify as a podcast or just someone talking on radio? Well, I think that the definition of podcast is, again, like I mentioned, it's like the definition of video, right? Yeah, anything, there are a lot of things that fall under that umbrella, and Mud Ki Baat absolutely does. Some tips for creators who want to step into the podcasting industry. This is from Farhan Rajni. Be consistent, be regular. I mean, like, make sure that your audio quality is set. Don't put two people in front of a mic and just expect it to work. If you're looking to do something professional, if you're looking to do something just like, two people just talking, then yeah, that can work. But if your aspirations for being professionally, for it to be a professional quality podcast, don't just like, set up a mic and just have two people talk into it. Take some effort in terms of figuring out how you can get multiple mics, use Audacity to record, take multi-channel recordings, do some of that. That's important. Nikhil, it's early version of podcast, but to maintain. No, he's answering a question. The next one is Suraj Vardhan is asking, what are the basic set of things required to start a podcast, like subject, speaker list, etc. I mean, like the way I look at this is, I mean, you can go to our website, and if you go to our website, you'll find a list. Sorry, you'll find a contact page, and the contact page will have a creators page, and over there, there's a creators brief that you can get. Right, this is what we kind of try and get people to think about before. Like a lot of people mistake an episode idea with a show idea. So it's important that you plan some things out a little bit in terms of what should be there. But yeah, I think that it's important to have a little bit of planning before you go into a podcast. You should have a theme. You should know what topics you're going to talk about. But you should also have an idea what your first 10, 15, 20 episodes are going to be like, right? What's the content going to be in those shows? Diksha Tharwani, well, the adoption rate of podcasts in India is quite low. What can be done for that? We're working on it. We're working on it hard, Diksha. I think that I'm very, very pleased with growth rate, not so pleased with total overall number. Overall number needs to increase dramatically, but if the growth rate continues at the rate that is continuing, we will be where we want to be within a year or two. Suraj Vardhan, no, sorry, this was Kisle Jha says, I look like Amit Shah. Thank you, Kisle. I've never heard that before. Anurag Bhatt also says I look like Amit Shah. Yes, Anurag, I do look like Amit Shah. Nikhil, I read Gimlet Media bought by Spotify for around $500,000 to get into this game. How is the future in India? So Nikhil, Gimlet was bought for 250 million, not half a billion. But yeah, no, I think it's a interesting space for us to be in. For many of those reasons, right? Salman Mushir, how is the reach of podcasts affected due to saturation internationally? You rarely find new Indian podcasts through discovery on top podcast apps, right? So I think Castbox has been tremendously helpful in that. I think Google Podcasts has been tremendously helpful in that. They make sure that you are seeing what is happening locally on your discovery pages. Apple Podcasts is getting there. They are doing more and more stuff in that space. Pocket Cast has been disappointing in that context. They don't have any kind of localization, and they're one of the bigger apps. Uh, but yeah, no, I think that it is a challenge. But I think one of the ways that you break out is by making awareness happen outside of the podcasting apps. The number of people who look at podcasting app discovery pages and find a new podcast to listen to is actually quite low. Most people find out about podcasts through other means, whether that is a blog post somewhere, a social media post somewhere, something like that. That's how most people are finding out about podcasting. Jagruti asks, are there no good tools available at this point to measure analytics related to podcasts? So, Jagruti, the challenge is that podcasting functions mostly on RSS feeds. When you function on RSS feeds, what you have is basically you have an enclosure file which points to an MP3 file. And the MP3 file is then downloaded onto a local device, whether it's a phone or a computer or what have you, right? And then you're consuming it from that local device using an app. At that point, there is no connection between the server and the client when your consumption is occurring. Because of that, the amount of information that you can get is minimal, unless you control both the client and the server, right? So, I mean, like in this case, we only control the server. So, one of the ways that we are looking at getting better information is by pushing our app a little bit more than we have till now. Till now, we were very app agnostic. But as things go forward, we're looking at our app as becoming more and more important. So that for exactly this reason, so we can get better analytics. Manas Naik, thanks a lot for sharing Indian cases. Very enriching starting my journey as a podcaster soon. We'll see guidance. Manas, go to our creators page, send me an email, send me the creative brief, and send me this. When did I leave politics? Modi asked me back. Miraj Rizvi asked me, please go back. You really want me to go back, man? I think I'm better off here. Abhishek Dil Khushra Jain asks, how would podcasts work in promoting film other than affiliating with some podcast channels? Well, I think there are a lot of interesting things that can happen over there. We've seen some interesting use cases around how podcasts are used with films, right? You create a podcast which is associated with the film. You can, so for example, Chernobyl had a podcast which came out in association with the TV show. There was a podcast which came out with the Netflix show about Rajneesh. I'm sorry, the name is escaping me. Wild Country. I'm sorry, the name is escaping me right now. But the Rajneesh documentary that Netflix did, there was a podcast that came out in association with that. So I think that you'll see stuff like that happening. Affiliating with other podcast channels is fine. You know, I mean, like that. Podcasting is a promotional medium like any other promotional medium for them. If we ever have a good idea, Suraj Vardhan, if we ever have a good idea, do we need to be in Mumbai to edit or record it? Is it possible? Also, it's possible from wherever. Send me an email, Suraj, with what you want to do, and we'll see what we can do. Saloni, I look forward to catching up with you too. And Suraj Cyrus, when will Cyrus allow his guests to finish the questions? I think this is a good quiet place to ask because I keep getting this question over and over again. Cyrus is Cyrus. He does what he does, man. I mean, like, there's a reason why he's as popular as he is, and part of that is the fact that he's a hyperactive guy who just kind of like talks. So, I mean, like, I don't think that you're going to see him let a lot of people finish questions like that. But yeah, anyway, thanks a lot, guys. This was a really fun session to do. If anybody wants to reach out to me, my email is amit@indusvox.com. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, that's fine as well. I'm Doshi Amit on Twitter. I respond to most things I see. And if you want to make a podcast, send us an email at creators@indusvox.com and we'll get back to you shortly. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to log off now.